Hey, Lobbert here with another discussion video. Before we get started, I just want to clarify what I said at the start of the last video. I am not going to make these discussion videos exclusive to patrons. I charge per creation, and at the time, my Patreon said that I only charged for gameplay videos, so I just wanted to let people know that I was changing the deal I have with them. The only thing I keep behind a paywall is a shoutout. Please consider giving this video a like, and we'll get started. Our last discussion video was mana rocks, and I got some great responses. On Reddit, Scarecrow1779, a Pauper Commander Rules Committee member, weighed in. To summarize, he argued that creatures that produce mana shouldn't be in F tier because there are decks that benefit from having large numbers of creatures enough that make it worth the risk, and I agree. I put too many things in F tier. By my own definitions of the tiers, I know that those creatures should be higher, and I agree that they should be C tier. He also makes good points about orbs and lockets. Brad with the PDH pod agrees with Scarecrow, especially about Ornithopter of Paradise, going even further to say that he'd rank it B tier. That's probably fair, because in my opinion, it's the best mana-producing artifact creature. Alcatron, another Rules Committee member and co-host of the PDH pod, responded to my comment that Honored Heirloom might be the best graveyard hate by suggesting that Fairy Macabre is better, and I agree. Since that video was created, I think the community as a whole has come down on Honored Heirloom a lot. Holding up that mana isn't what many decks are trying to do. Now let's get into the main topic this time, protection spells. I'm a little apprehensive to do this one because it's such a broad topic, because I'm not just talking about spells and effects that give the keyword protection. I count anything that protects or otherwise negates interaction from your opponent as protection. Because the topic is so broad, I'm not going to be ranking them exactly like I did in other videos. Instead, I'm going to categorize them so that we can discuss all the pros and cons of each kind before going through individual cards. All protection spells are appealing for a few reasons. Tempo. Almost any protection spell is going to have a lower mana value than whatever it is you're protecting, which means that you can keep your opponents on the back foot. High value. As long as you're able to afford them, protection spells can be additional lives for whatever you choose is valuable enough to protect. The higher value your permanent is, the better the protection spells get. Protection spells are unappealing for a few reasons too. Many are not proactive. If you have nothing in play, or what you have isn't very impactful, these can just rot in your hand. That's why, just like with every card in our deck, we look for additional functionality and value, and I figure we should start with the most literal one first. The keyword protection. As a reminder, having protection from something with a specified quality means that it cannot be damaged, enchanted, equipped, blocked, or targeted by sources of the specified quality, and that quality in Pauper Commander is almost always color. So not only do these prevent your stuff from being removed by almost every source that targets, they also protect against damage-based board wipes. Because of this, I find that they are best used at instant speed. There are decks that use it well, but in most decks, Pentarch Ward performs poorly because you don't get the 1-for-1 that's built into anything that's instant speed. Drawing the card off of Pentarch Ward means that it replaces itself, but only if it resolves. In my experience though, this just turns whatever you're attempting to enchant into a lightning rod. When it's your last chance to remove something that's already valued highly enough to have a Pentarch Ward on it, you use your removal. The only times this will go through is when there is no removal. All that being said, Pentarch Ward does take advantage of the can't be blocked clause of protection pretty well. Additionally, the chances are high that if your creature is unblockable for player 1, the other two players are most likely going to let your creature stick around, because they know where your creature is attacking turn after turn. There are some enchantments with flash that are similar to Pentarch Ward though. Benevolent Blessing, Chomino's Blessing, and to some extent Ward of Lights also stick around more than one turn, and they can all be used at instant speed, which really makes them all-stars. What really pushes these cards over the top is what's not written on these cards. They don't have to enchant a creature you control, but if your opponent is trying to target their creature, or if it's already enchanted by something, these will prevent them from being targeted and remove the enchantment, so they can act as interaction in some cases. Also, don't let the fact that Ward of Lights removes itself at the end of turn keep you from putting it in your deck. If you use it on your opponent's creature, you may not want to give your creature protection for more than one turn. Stave Off is an instant with similar wording. It doesn't stick around like the enchantments, but it only costs 1, which makes it one of the best white spells we have. Freed from the Reel, Ghostly Flicker, and Ophidian Eye are some of the strongest combo pieces in the format, and running these protection spells allows you to interact. But even in the situations where the combo doesn't directly target, you're sometimes able to follow up. For example, say that your opponent has Dargo the Shipwrecker, and they're about to create infinite mana using Thermopod that's in play. They sacrifice Dargo, and another player sees their opportunity, so they play Doomblade on Thermopod. The Dargo player tries to give Thermopod hexproof by playing Dive Down. There is now a chance for you to play Stave Off on Thermopod to give it protection from blue so that Dive Down fizzles, and Thermopod will be removed by Doomblade. There are other enchantments that give protection that I'm skipping because they really suffer from only working at sorcery speed. Floating Shield, though, is an aura that I had no idea that existed until now. It's noteworthy because yes, it's an enchantment without flash that gives protection, but it can be sacrificed at instant speed to give any creature protection. It also suffers from being 3 mana, which is probably why I've never seen it, but the sacrifice for no additional mana investment and being able to target anything is interesting. Some decks synergize well with creatures, so they might want to consider these. Benevolent Bodyguard is a creature that grants protection from a color at instant speed as long as it's already in play. The low cost to play and free activation allow you to tap out more often, which makes this guy incredible. Moonlit Strider is similar to Benevolent Bodyguard, but it costs 4 times as much, so I've never actually seen it played. I won't say it looks terrible though. Crimson Acolyte and Obsidian Acolyte give any creature, including your opponents, protection from red or black respectively, and don't need to be sacrificed. They just cost a single white to activate. Being able to target your opponent's creatures is definitely worth noting, but red and black are colors of removal, but these are definitely more for protecting your own creatures. Midvast Protector gives protection when it enters, so it suffers too much from being sorcery speed like Pentarch Ward. There's also a land that gives protection. Tajiri Step gives a creature protection when it enters, so it can be returned to your hand by things like bounce lands or flashed in with Walking Atlas style effects. It's also tutorable with crop rotation. The effect can't be countered by most spells and effects since it's colorless, so if you're able to flash it in, it can be very strong. The rest of the spells that grant protection that I wanted to speak about are instants. Blessed Breath only offers utility if you're playing arcane spells, which is very uncommon. God's Willing also costs 1 and has a clear upside that every deck can take advantage of. It allows you to scry 1. I like to dream a little bit bigger than this though, so I often find myself cutting it. Emerge Unscathed sees a fair amount of play because the rebound works well in decks that care about the number of spells being cast. Even when it's not in a Spells Matter deck, when you cast Emerge Unscathed off of rebound, it can make your creature unblockable much of the time. Center Soul is literally a 2-cost version of Emerge Unscathed, and that's still good enough to see play. The last spell that gives protection is Apostle's Blessing. The Phyrexian mana gives this flexibility if you don't have the spare mana, but the most important part of this card is that it can give protection from artifacts, and it can target your artifacts. Giving protection from an artifact may seem like a corner case, but Third Path Iconoclast is a very popular deck, so Apostle's Blessing just might be the utility you're looking for. It also comes in handy if you highly value an artifact like Ashnod's Altar and want to protect it. Just like most spells, from going from 1 to 2 mana hurts protection spells a lot. Much of the time you won't have anything else to do with that mana, so if you don't cast the protection spell, it's wasted. But the 2 mana ones can usually offer additional utility if you're willing to spend the extra mana. Angelic Intervention and Feat of Resistance both give a +1/+1 counter, and Angelic Intervention can even give protection from colorless. If your plan is just to attack, an extra counter can go a really long way, and many decks have additional synergies with +1/+1 counters. I've been surprised many times by how much a small power and toughness bump can make combat easier. Shelter draws you a card, which I shouldn't have to explain why that's good. One thing this means though, is that you're going to be tempted to play this as soon as you can to extract your value. Many of these protection spells you'll want to save until the right moment, but in my experience, I want to draw the card off of Shelter so bad so I can keep being proactive that I'll just block and cast this or something instead of saving it to be the clutch spell. Costing 2 also encourages you to play it as soon as you can. A lot of decks just don't like holding up that much mana. Razor Barrier tries to justify spending 2 mana by allowing you to target a permanent instead of a creature, and allows you to give it protection from artifacts or a color, so if you have a land, artifact, or enchantment that you value extremely highly, this might be worth it. Crypsis is blue and only gives protection from creatures, which is pretty weak, but allowing you to untap the creature not only allows you to get a surprise blocker, there are quite a few commanders that want nothing more than every tap effect that they can have. Tel'Jallad Defiance draws you a card, but only giving protection from artifacts is way too narrow to be useful. That wraps up the protection spells, so next we have Flickers. Flickers protect your creature by exiling it and returning it to the battlefield, which the game doesn't count as the same creature, so anything targeting it or attached to it no longer does so. The most common reason players include Flicker cards is because not only do they protect your creatures, they trigger the enters or leaves the battlefield ability of whatever they targeted, which usually means that you can get a card or more worth of advantage on top of the innate 1-for-1 of protecting your creature. It's also important to note that because the target is considered a new creature, if it was attacking, it's no longer attacking. In my opinion, this means Flicker effects lend themselves better to strategies that don't rely on attacking, like Control or Combo. The creature also comes in untapped, which can give you a surprise blocker. On top of that, if your blocker is already untapped, you can block and flicker your blocker to blank an attack as long as the attacker doesn't have trample. Additionally, aggressive decks are more likely to use things like equipment, +1/+1 counters, and auras that flicker effects make fall off, which again lends itself more strongly to combo and control, not to mention the fact that flickers can't be used to protect tokens. Speaking of combo, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that these can also justify their place in your deck by going infinite. The most common way to do this is with something that untaps your land like Peregrine Drake. Cloud of Fairies can also be used if you use land enchantments to increase how much mana you can generate per flicker. These don't go infinite alone though. Something that returns your flicker spell to your hand like Archaeomancer is needed, so the first flicker cards that I want to spotlight are Ghostly Flicker and Displace. Ghostly Flicker is the better one because it can also target artifacts and lands, but both of these are very good. This 3-card combo only goes infinite on mana, but if you have a 4th card with an enters or leaves the battlefield effect that draws a card like Mulldrifter, you're able to draw your entire deck. And from there, it's usually pretty easy to win. Even if you're forced to use these flickers to protect your creatures before you combo, the Archaeomancer types of cards put the card back in your hand when it comes into play. Ephemerate is also super noteworthy because it can loop with an Archaeomancer for value. Because it has Rebound, you can't get it back from the graveyard right away, but you can get a different card, and then return Ephemerate to your hand when you cast it for free the second time. So it doesn't go infinite, but it is a loop. Ghostly Flicker and Displace are both 3 mana, so they can sometimes be hard to hold up as protection spells, but Ephemerate only costs 1, making it both easy to hold up and a great source of card advantage. All the other flickers in the format only target one thing, so they're still good, definitely not on the same level as those last 3. Momentary Blink comes the closest, since you can flash it back, but because it's exiled after that, I don't really count it among the other 3. Paying 4 to flash it back can definitely be worth it, but it will take up a significant amount of resources the turn you do so. Cloudshift is a flicker for 1 white mana. It's the only flicker beside Ephemerate that costs 1, so it sees a lot of play. Cloudshift is also worded so it returns the creature under your control, which means if you use Act of Treason to gain control of an opponent's creature and Cloudshift it, the creature does not return to their control at the end of turn, because it's not the same creature that had the effect on it. Ghostly Flicker is also worded this way. One thing to note though is that it doesn't work on commanders. For 2 mana you're able to afford some flickers that are able to target your opponent's creatures, like Flicker of Fate, Otherworldly Journey, and Turn to Mist. Flickering your opponent's creatures provides a lot of the same benefits that giving your opponent's creatures protection from a color does, like removing auras, equipment, and fizzling spells that target it. Flickers also remove +1/+1 counters, give the target summoning sickness, and remove the creature from combat. Otherworldly Journey and Turn to Mist are also called slow flickers, which means that they don't return the creature to play until the start of the next end step. That can be a benefit or a drawback. A big drawback of a slow flicker is that you no longer get your value back immediately, so if you're trying to combo off with Archaeomancer, a slow flicker may save your creature, but you can't keep comboing off this turn. Flicker spells can also act as removal spells for enemy tokens, and the slow flickers can even remove a blocker for the turn. That makes these good enough that I would put them in your deck by default, and only remove them if you have a strong reason. Nefarious Time Twist is another slow flicker. It's just like Otherworldly Journey, except it only targets a creature you control. Both of them also give the creature a +1/+1 counter, which, as I said when we spoke about the spells that give protection from a color and a +1/+1 counter, it can make a big difference. A 3/3 Mulldrifter is nothing to sniff at. It's true that decks that run these don't win through combat as often, but putting a counter on an evasive creature can sneak you wins. Planar Incision is similar to Teferi's Time Twist in that it puts a +1/+1 counter on the creature, but it's not a slow flicker, so you can really customize which flickers best suit your deck. Planar Incision also allows you to target artifacts, which allows this to be a redraw if you have something like Arkham's Astrolabe or Ichor Wellspring. Pegasus Guardian's Adventure Half, Rescue the Full, is a vanilla flicker for 2, with the added benefit that if it resolves, you can play the Pegasus Guardian half of this later, which actually synergizes with flickers. The Pegasus Guardian half is very expensive though. The other 2 mana flickers are Justicar's Portal, which gives the creature first strike this turn, Siren's Ruse, which gives you an extra card when it flickers a pirate, and Slip on the Ring, which makes the ring tempt you. I consider all of the benefits of these cards minimally helpful in most decks. Acrobatic Maneuver, Blur, and Scroll Shift are all 3 mana flickers that draw you a card. The only notable difference between them is that Scroll Shift allows you to target artifacts or enchantments as well. Side note, Scroll Shift and Flicker of Fate are the only flicker effects that allow you to target enchantments. That's significant because you can do some really weird things like that. When an aura re-enters the battlefield, it must enchant something, and because it didn't have to go on the stack, whatever it attaches to is chosen instead of targeted. That means that you can enchant something with Reprobation to make it a 0/2 with no abilities, Flicker Reprobation, and put it on a creature with Hexproof or Shroud. If it's something like Slippery Bogle, it would even then lose its Hexproof from the effect of Reprobation. I'm getting a little off topic though. Acrobatic Maneuver, Blur, and Scroll Shift are pretty mana intensive, but if you count the 1-for-1 of protecting your creature, the card draw off of the Flicker, and the enters the battlefield ability of your creature, these will most likely give you at least +2 on card advantage. Icewind Stalwart comes with a nice body, but flickering at sorcery speed is much less useful. You get the flickered creature's enters the battlefield ability, and it untaps, but it's not going to be protecting anything. Our last flicker is Settle Beyond Reality. Even being an exiling removal spell in addition to flickering isn't enough to make up for being sorcery speed and costing 5. I don't think that there's a flicker deck out there that's this desperate for card advantage. Now let's move on to Grave Flickers. Grave Flicker spells return your creature to the battlefield after they die. Comparing these to what we've discussed so far, all of them can protect a creature from a spell that destroys a creature, but Grave Flickers are the only one that protect you from effects that make you sacrifice a creature. Conversely, Grave Flickers do not protect against a lot of other common types of removals, such as exiling, bouncing, or being enchanted. A way around that is to play the Grave Flicker and then sacrifice your creature to another card. This dependency on requiring another card to work in some cases is a weakness, but the payoff is that the card used to sacrifice the creature should also be providing some kind of advantage, in addition to the creature getting its death or enters the battlefield ability. Spells like Village Rites, Corrupted Conviction, Deadly Dispute, and Witch's Cauldron can provide some great value. The issue is that they require you to leave up mana for them, on top of your Grave Flicker mana, which can be difficult. There are free onboard effects like Ashnod's Altar, Carrion Feeder, and Viscera Seer that provide less value, but they are easy to activate. Grave Flickers also work well with effects that force a player to sacrifice a creature because the death of your creature is built in. Grave Flickers can also be enabled through combat where your creature dies though, which makes them better in aggro decks than classic Flickers because you're potentially able to remove a creature because combat damage still goes through when you use them. They're not quite as aggressive as effects that give protection from a color though, because the creature loses its +1/+1 counters, equipment, and auras. It's a trade-off of value, consistency, and aggression. Speaking of consistency, the way that Grave Flickers work is that when the creature dies, an ability goes on the stack that brings back the creature into play when it resolves. The issue is that before it resolves, players can respond to the ability and exile your creature out of your graveyard to stop you. Now let's actually talk about some Grave Flickers. Supernatural Stamina, Abnormal Endurance, Demonic Gifts, and Fake Your Own Death are all Grave Flickers that give your creature +2/+0. Demonic Gifts is the only one that allows your creature to enter untapped, and Fake Your Own Death gives you a treasure, but both of these cost 2 while the others cost 1. The extra 2 power that these provide is actually a great benefit because it allows you to be very aggressive. Undying Malice, Feign Death, and Undying Evil are all 1-mana Grave Flickers that return the creature with a +1/+1 counter, but Undying Evil and Feign Death return the creature tapped, and Undying Evil returns it untapped, but it doesn't work if your creature already has a +1/+1 counter on it. Out of these 3, I prefer the ones that return the creature tapped. Undying Evil not working if your creature has a counter is a scenario that comes up often, even if you don't run cards that put counters on creatures, because the initiative usually puts +1/+1 counters on things, and it's not difficult for your opponents to put them on your creature either. If we compare these Grave Flickers that add a counter to the ones that give a temporary power buff, the ones that add a counter are better against removal spells, and they're better when you're using them proactively like with Fleshbag Marauder. The ones with a temporary buff allow you to attack into defenders with higher toughness more profitably right away as a surprise. So one is better generally, and the other is closer to a combat trick with some utility. Return to Action costs 2 mana and only gives a temporary +1 attack, but it makes up for it by giving the creature lifelink. Like the 1-mana Grave Flickers that give a temporary buff, this is definitely best used as a combat trick, so that you can take advantage of the lifelink, but you'll use it against a spell in a pinch. This is actually one of my favorites, because it's an easy way to cram some life gain onto a card that protects you, and allows you to be more aggressive, which is a lot of things to be good at. Angelic Renewal looks a lot different than our other Grave Flickers, and it isn't an instant, but it does the same thing as the others. It allows a creature to enter the graveyard, then puts it back into play. Being an enchantment means that it doesn't target, so it can't be fizzled, so even if your creature dies and your opponent exiles your creature in response to the Angelic Renewal trigger, the Angelic Renewal doesn't go away. It sticks around until you use it, which makes it very consistent. The drawbacks are that you don't get a power toughness buff, that your opponent knows about it, and that it's vulnerable to enchantment removal, but the biggest reason that I end up putting it in my decks is that it doesn't cost any additional mana to activate when you need it, so you're able to tap out completely without being completely vulnerable. Graceful Reprieve is another white Graveflicker, but it costs 2 and doesn't provide any additional value, so I don't think it's very good. Infuse with Vitality is 2 mana, 2 colors, and puts the creature into play tapped, but it gives the creature Death Touch and 2 life. Death Touch is a surprisingly powerful keyword in this format. In combat, the Death Touch allows you to be even more aggressive than the Grave Flickers that give a temporary power buff, because you're not just able to kill something a little bigger than your attackers, you don't care how high their toughness is at all. Decks with First Strike or Trample should also consider this card a little more. Kai's Ghost Form is a targeted sorcery speed spell, so, of course, I don't think it's very good. It protects your creature from being exiled in addition to protecting it from dying, but that's not enough to overcome thinking about the moment where this goes on the stack and the incentive for your opponents to kill your high value target goes through the roof. It can serve a function in decks that really want to Grave Flicker proactively or are able to recur enchantments though. Unholy Indenture, Unhallowed Pact, and False Demise are 3 mana and sorcery speed, so they make really terrible protection spells, but they aren't meant for your own creatures. Unlike all of the other Grave Flickers, they can enchant your opponent's creatures and put them into play under your control when they die. Unholy Indenture even gives the creature a +1/+1 counter. I would recommend against this though, because just like the Act of Treason plus Ghostly Flicker interaction, it won't work on a commander, because your opponent can return it to the command zone when it hits the graveyard. Next is Hexproof. Hexproof only protects from targeted effects, which makes it one of the simplest ways of protecting your creatures. You don't have to worry about it clashing with your equipment, enchantments, counters, or even if your creature is attacking like the previous ones do, which is a good thing, but it can be frustrating when your commander has already been enchanted with legitimate business person or something. Hexproof also doesn't innately generate advantage off of enters the battlefield or death triggers, so any additional advantage needs to be printed on the card, so let's get right to it. Lauren's Escape and Blacksmith's Skill both give the creature Indestructible in addition to Hexproof. Lauren's Escape is the more consistent of the two because you always get to scry, but Blacksmith's Skill gives an additional +2/+2 if the creature is an artifact, which adds some corner case utility. The Indestructible shores up the weakness that these have against damage-based board wipes and allow them to be used as a combat trick. In most cases though, that won't be enough to make them better than a spell that gives protection from a color. Parameter's Blessing gives +2/+2, but if your creature's enchanted or is an enchantment, it gives Hexproof and Indestructible as well, so it's inconsistent in most decks. Beaming Defiance gives +2/+2 consistently, but white just has so many better options for 2 mana. Dive Down is just worse than the white Hexproof spells that give Indestructible in most ways, but being in blue where protection's not an alternative, this offers some protection against board wipes and can help a bit in combat, which actually makes it really good. Blue has a much greater ability to draw cards, so dedicating a few slots to a spell like this feels better than it does in other colors. Shield Shell is the same as Dive Down, but you only get the Hexproof if you pay an additional 1. The modality is appealing, but the competition in blue at 2 mana is steep enough that I don't see myself playing this anytime soon. Glint is the same as Shield Shell, but paying the extra 1 is mandatory, so it's even worse than Shield Shell. Mizzium Skin gives a smaller toughness buff than Dive Down, but it has Overload, which isn't super relevant in regards to stopping 2 or more spells at the same time, since it's very rare for your opponent to play another removal spell before the first one resolves, but Mizzium Skin is still good because the toughness boost of your team can potentially save multiple creatures from a board wipe or combat. Shore Up is another one of my favorites. It gives the creature +1/+1 and untaps it in addition to giving it Hexproof. The stat boost combined with the untap can give you a surprise blocker, or it can still be a cheap protection spell. You See a Guard Approach is another efficient spell that gives Hexproof. It doesn't give an additional effect at the same time, but it does offer modality in that it can tap a creature. I'll admit that tapping a creature isn't going to be used often, but efficiency and modality are a recipe for success as long as one of the modes is viable. Cradle of Safety and Starlit Mantle are enchantments with flash that give Hexproof the turn that they come in, and give +1/+1 as long as they're in play. There are just too many 2-mana spells in blue that can protect your creature for these to be good in most decks, but if you have an enchantment synergy, or some kind of other synergy with them, the +1/+1 is really nice. Cyber Cryptomancer is similar to the enchantments in that it has flash and gives a creature Hexproof temporarily, and +1/+1 more permanently, but this does so by putting a +1/+1 counter on it. Having an extra body is always nice, and the fact that the extra body has hexproof only helps. The body must be pretty important, because I see this all the time, and never see the enchantments. In green, Tamiyo's safekeeping looks very similar to Lauren's escape and blacksmith skill, but it's way better because it allows you to target any permanent you control. It still doesn't offer the same card advantage as flickers, and protection from a color has other utilities, but Tamiyo's safekeeping offers a cheap unique ability that gains you 2 life to boot, making it very good. Snakeskin Veil only costs 1, and puts a counter on your creature in addition to hexproof, so it's consistently all upside, so I'm a big fan of this one. Ranger's Guile is similar to Snakeskin Veil, but the +1/+1 is temporary, which makes it significantly worse, because it, like the other spells that give a temporary buff, isn't guaranteed to have any upside, so the plus is more like an additional mode than a second effect, and +1/+1 by itself is pretty weak. Gaia's Gift feels like it does everything in an aggressive deck. It avoids the usual combat weakness that Hexproof has by giving it Indestructible, it permanently pumps your creature by putting a +1/+1 counter on it that we've already talked about making a difference in this format, and it gives you a bit of evasion with Trample, in addition to giving Hexproof. As a result, this goes in a lot of green decks. Sheltering Word gains you life equal to the target's toughness in addition to giving Hexproof. The effect scales so you can gain quite a bit of life in the right deck, but a lot of decks are not able to create a creature large enough or need life gain enough to make me want to pay 2 for a protection spell. Bombadil's Song gives a temporary +1/+1 and makes the ring tempt you in addition to giving hexproof. You could have probably guessed that I don't like this card because the +1/+1 is temporary, and there's not that many decks that care about the evasion that the first ability of the ring gives. Blinding Fog gives all of your creatures hexproof and prevents combat damage to all creatures. Like I mentioned with Mizium Skin, it's very unlikely to stop multiple targeted spells, so it's 3 mana to potentially stop 1 spell. I spoke about the fog side of this card in my fog video, but to make it short, it's only good when you have blockers, which is bad. Modality is usually good, but the price is not right on this. Woodcutter's Grit gives +3/+3 in addition to giving hexproof. 3 is just not a good rate for this. And our last hexproof card is Elgod's Shieldmate. It's a 2/3 with Soul Bond, which gives hexproof. This kind of has the same issue that other sorcery speed protection spells do, in that it incentivizes your opponents to take action immediately when it's played. But because it sticks around, if your opponent kills the high value creature that you're trying to pair it with, you'll still have the option to Soul Bond this to the next high value threat you play, but the Elgod's Shieldmate ends up eating the removal spell. The real reason I play it though, is that you can play this before your high value creature to protect it without having to expend additional mana on the turn that you play it. Yes, there's still that window where Soul Bond is on the stack that you're vulnerable, but that's a pretty small window, and the goal is to be able to play your threat earlier than you would have been able to otherwise if you needed to hold up protection. A 2/3 body with hexproof isn't bad either. There are also 2 spells that don't have the keyword, but they have functionally identical wording to them, except they can be put on your opponent's creatures to stop them from targeting them. Vines of Vestwood is the best of these, because for 1 mana, having the mode of protecting your creature in addition to the mode of stopping your opponent from targeting their own creature is already very good, but this also allows you to pay an additional green to give something a sizable +4/+4, which can also be pointed at your opponent's creatures if buffing them profits you. Shielding Plaques is a lot less exciting than Vines of Vastwood. It's essentially a worse Pentarch ward. Next is Shroud. Shroud is very similar to Hexproof, but it doesn't allow its controller to target it either, so there can be times where you resolve a Shroud spell, and then you'd like to target your creature with something else, but can't. The issue mostly comes up with spells that give Shroud for more than just 1 turn though. For example, Nurok Stealth Suit is an equipment that gives Shroud, and can be attached at instant speed. A repeatable lasting protection spell that works at instant speed sounds pretty incredible to me, but the initial mana investment to play the equipment and not allowing you to target the creature after it's attached can be really awkward if you want to use a trick in combat. You can move Nurok Stealth Suit to another creature, but having another creature isn't a given, and paying 1 or 2 more to be able to do it can be difficult. I think that leaves this equipment in a place where it can be really good in decks that don't need to target their own things often. Whispersilk Cloak is another equipment, but it gives the creature unblockable on top of giving it Shroud. There was a time where I thought every deck should play this card, but over and over, it just forced my opponents to play their removal spells on whatever I was trying to equip. Not to mention if an opponent removes the equipment after you've attacked, they're frequently able to profitably block it. That's a blowout. Investing 5 mana into something so risky is just hard to justify, but I know there are decks that can really use the unblockable. Yes, you can potentially try again because it's an equipment, but you're 7 mana into this thing at that point. Alexi's Cloak is an enchantment with flash that gives Shroud, so it also sticks around. Like all the other protection spells that can stop your opponent from targeting their own creature, the extra mode only improves this already powerful card. Like Benevolent Blessing and Chomino's Blessing, this prevents your opponent from trying to combo on another turn if you put it on their creature. Before putting it in your deck though, just make sure you won't be shutting off some of your own cards. Mystic Veil is nearly identical to Alexi's Cloak, but if you play it at instant speed, it sacrifices itself at the end of turn. I found that against aggro decks, I like being able to stop a big pump spell like Temur Battle Rage, but the ongoing Shroud from Alexi's Cloak can come back to bite you, so I've been playing Mystic Veil more than I thought I would. Robe Mirrors and Diplomatic Immunity are both enchantments with flash that give Shroud. They can target your opponent's creatures, but because it doesn't work like Protection, which removes things that are attached to it, I don't think that's going to do much the majority of the time. I would avoid running these. Ashnod's Desire is another 1-mana enchantment that gives Shroud, but only if you have Threshold, but at least it always gives flying. This is more of an evasion spell than a protection spell. Threshold is just inconsistent. I think I would only run this if I had a strong enchantment and combat damage synergy. Cloud of the Dominus is another 1-mana spell that can give Shroud. If it enchants a red or blue creature, which your commander will most likely be, it also gets +2/+2 in haste. I think the haste and Shroud alone would make this enough to be playable, so the extra +2/+2 feels great. Protective Bubble makes your creature unblockable in addition to giving it Shroud, so it works a lot like Whispersilk Cloak, but the 1-mana discount compared to playing and equipping Whispersilk Cloak isn't worth giving up the ability to re-equip it to other things, so I'd stay away from Protective Bubble. Instead, consider Veil of Secrecy, an instant that gives Shroud and unblockable for a turn. It can also target your opponent's creature, which gives this 3 relevant modes, but not all decks are going to care about the unblockable. It doesn't suffer from the Pentarch Ward problem, where everyone is incentivized to kill your target quite as bad because it will become targetable the next turn, and being combat-based, they know you can only hit one player with it, but you may have to do some politicking if your creature is large enough to eliminate a player, because few people will hold the removal spell, and just hope they don't die. Mage's Guile is another 2-mana instant that works on your opponent's creature, but the additional utility it offers is cycling for a single blue, which, just like Veil of Secrecy, gives this 3 modes, but any deck could make good use of these if they're willing to pay 2 to do it. Fortis Formation gives all of your creatures Shroud for a turn. It costs 4 mana, so it's not even worth considering for me. Hisoka's Guard is an interesting creature. It costs 2 to play and gives something you control Shroud for 2 more mana. It only works if it doesn't have Summoning Sickness, and you have to pay 4 mana to give your first target Shroud, so I have a hard time imagining what I'd use this for. Soratami Rainshaper, on the other hand, costs 3, but it's a 2/1 flyer, and I love evasive creatures that do something else while whittling down your opponents. It has an activated ability with the cost of returning a land to your hand, and 3 mana to give a creature you control Shroud this turn. The cost of returning a land to your hand can be an upside in some decks, and I love that it can be activated even if the creature is tapped. You can still stay aggressive with it. All that said, it is pretty mana intensive, so I'd only play it if I had a strong synergy. Shell Skulkin is surprisingly similar to Soratami Rainshaper in that it has an activated ability for 3 that gives Shroud, but it doesn't require you to return a land to your hand. But returning a land to your hand was actually one of the reasons to run Soratami Rainshaper. On top of that, Shell Skulkin costs an additional mana to play and doesn't have evasion, so I would avoid running it. Gilded Light is pretty unique. It gives you Shroud for a turn, but unique doesn't necessarily mean good. The spells that I'd be most excited to stop with this are ones that target you and make you sacrifice a creature, so I would prefer to just play another creature, but at least it has cycling. Next is Phasing. A creature with Phasing phases in or out during its controller's untap step before they untap. It doesn't use the stack, it just happens. While it's phased out, it's treated as though it doesn't exist, and when it comes back, it isn't considered to have entered or left the battlefield. So that means every other turn, you'll have your creature. Additionally, any counters, equipment, and auras that are attached to it indirectly phase in and out when the creature does. It's a little complicated, but not existing is an extremely effective way to not die. It's the only effect that protects from curfew, edict effects, board wipes, and targeted removal, but I don't actually want to talk about phasing. I want to talk about a few cards that phase a creature out at instant speed. Reality Ripple is the real reason that phasing is relevant to this discussion at all. It targets artifacts, creatures, and lands, so it can protect most things. You can even phase out auras indirectly by phasing out the creature they're attached to. You'll also notice that this can phase out your opponent's permanent, which really pushes this over the edge and into being a hidden gem. You can fizzle their spells and remove their blockers without even having to worry about triggering an opponent's enter the battlefield ability, like a slow flicker would. The decks that don't want this are things like flicker decks that want to target their own creatures. They just want whatever they have on the stack targeting their creature to resolve, and can't afford to fizzle their own spell. Vision Charm can only phase out artifacts, which is too narrow for my liking, and the other modes aren't super appealing. Vanishing is a one-cost aura that lets you pay 2 to phase the creature out. I really dislike having to pay an additional mana every time I need the protection, so I would be much more likely to play this as a removal spell. The card I want to compare this to is Oubliette, which you know is powerful. The initial mana investment into this is the same, but you get to choose when you do it. That gives you a lot of control over that player. It becomes in their best interest to keep being proactive against your other opponents and put off dealing with you momentarily. Next is Indestructible. Indestructible by itself is actually pretty narrow. It protects against effects that say destroy, and ignores lethal damage, so there's a lot that it lets through. It also doesn't act as protection when you put it on an opponent's creature like some other types of protection do. We've already discussed Blacksmith's Skill, Karametra's Blessing, Lauren's Escape, Amio's Safekeeping, and Gaia's Gift. It speaks volumes that they're able to put Indestructible on a card in addition to Hexproof. It kind of needs help to be as good as the other forms of protection that we discussed. I find that I like playing it in aggressive decks more than anything so I can keep my +1/+1 counters, equipment, and enchantments. But Johnny's Presence gives a creature +1/+1 for a turn, in addition to Indestructible, and it can target additional creatures for 3 mana each. The ability is subpar if it targets one creature, and targeting more than one is both a bad rate, and the effect is rarely worth it. Blessed Hippogriff's Adventure Half, Tyr's Blessing, only gives Indestructible, but it only costs 1 mana, and it comes with a 2/3 flyer later on, which makes it good enough to go in most of my decks. It's a good mix of adding resiliency and being proactive that I can't say no to. The Hippogriff's attack ability can also be pretty relevant. Flying always is. Built to Last gives a creature +2/+2, and only gives Indestructible if it's an artifact creature, which makes it very narrow. Even if you play all artifact creatures, it's not a very impressive effect. Adamant Will is identical to Built to Last, except it works on any type of creature. It is consistent, but I was already wondering if this effect was worth it at 1 mana, so at 2 mana, it's pretty unimpressive. Ephemeral Shields only gives Indestructible, but it has Convoke, so you can tap your creatures to pay for it. In a lot of white decks, this is a free spell, which I have found to be very powerful. Flare of Faith only gives Indestructible if the creature is human. Otherwise, it's just +2/+2, which is really disappointing at 2 mana. As with the other pumps, it's just not exciting enough as an effect to be very appealing even in a human deck. Take Up the Shield gives a creature a +1/+1 counter and lifelink for a turn in addition to Indestructible. I really like this spell. Giving the creature lifelink is only beneficial in combat, but making the combat mode better can be big on those last couple turns. The +1/+1 is always welcome whether you play it as a combat trick or to stop a destruction or damaging spell. Break of Day gives your creatures +1/+1 for a turn and only gives your creatures Indestructible if you have 5 or less life, so it's not giving you Indestructible the majority of the time. Rootborn Defenses costs 3 mana, but it always gives all of your creatures Indestructible. Many white decks win by playing tons of creatures, so Fiery Cannonade, Breath Weapon, and Sulphurous Blast can stop you in your tracks. Rootborn Defenses can give you resiliency for that, while also working as a combat trick for multiple creatures. The card also says Populate, so you get a free token out of the deal sometimes. Your Temple is Under Attack also gives your creatures Indestructible, so it also sees play. It also has a second mode that lets you and opponent each draw 2 cards, but that's usually only used when you're desperate. Angel Heart Protector gives a creature Indestructible when it enters, so it's sorcery speed and temporary. You can flicker this to give something Indestructible, but if you have a flicker, you could also just save the creature, so this is pretty bad in most decks. Survive the Night costs 3, gives a creature +1 power, and creates a clue in addition to giving Indestructible. It replaces itself, but it's way too much mana to do that. Armor of Shadows and Unlikely Aid give the creature an attack bonus in addition to Indestructible, so, like many of the other Indestructible spells, makes a better combat trick than a protection spell. I tend to avoid playing these. Professor's Warning can give Indestructible, or a +1/+1 counter to a creature. It has surprised me by how many times this thing puts a counter on something to save it. Battle Rage Blessing and Offer Immortality give the creature Death Touch in addition to Indestructible, which again makes it a pretty good combat trick, especially against stack blockers. I like pairing this with creatures with Menace and Trample when I can. Outside of combat, it's nice to have the protection, but that mode is secondary most of the time. Bladed Battle Fan is an equipment with flash that attaches to a creature when it enters and gives the creature indestructible for a turn. It also gives the creature +1/+0. It's very nice that you still get the power boost if you have to use this outside of combat, but it's even more nice that you can equip for only 1 mana after the first creature dies. 1 extra power over a few turns can really open up possibilities for aggressive decks. Oblivion's Hunger gives a creature indestructible and only draws you a card if the creature had a +1/+1 counter on it. I have not played with this because it looks like it would only go in a counters matter deck, but I think, like Shelter, its ability to draw a card will encourage the unappealing play of doing this at sorcery speed to be proactive, and 2 mana for indestructibility isn't a great rate in the first place, because of all of the types of removal this doesn't help with. Without Weakness only gives indestructible, but it can also be cycled. I found that I like cycling a lot less than other people. It's never a dead card at the cost of tempo, but I just think that the rate on playing or cycling this are both not great. Rush of Vitality gives a creature a temporary +1 attack and lifelink in addition to indestructible, which makes it worse than Take Up the Shield, but it's in a color that's not quite as competitive with its protection spells, so I find myself wanting to play more effects like this in black. Black is also a color that can leverage its life total, so I like the life gain even more in black. Orcish Medicine allows you to amass Orcs 1, and it can give indestructible or lifelink. Making you choose between those 2 keywords really hurts this card, but for 2 mana, getting a token is actually kind of nice. It's especially useful if you play spells like Innocent Blood that cause each creature to sacrifice, which is very common. Renegade's Getaway costs 3 mana and creates a 1/1 artifact token, so it's much worse than Orcish Medicine. Withstand Death only gives indestructible. This card is pretty much unplayable as far as I'm concerned. The best case scenario for this is that you 1-for-1 an opponent an inconsistent amount of the time based on your opponent's removal. Mortal's Resolve puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature in addition to giving it indestructible. Doubling the mana for Withstand Death for +1/+1 doesn't really sweeten the deal unless I'm desperate for that +1/+1 counter. If Shield of the Oversoul is put on a white and green creature, it gives +2/+2 and flying in addition to indestructible. I think the biggest reason to play this is the evasion. The indestructible may come in handy so that your opponent can't kill it in battle, and it blocks very well, but you're still getting 2-for-1 when they make you sacrifice the creature, and you're 1-for-1 when they return it to your hand, and now you're behind on tempo. Outmuscle is a sorcery speed fight spell that puts a +1/+1 counter on your creature, and it gives indestructible until end of turn if 3 or more green mana was spent on it, and it costs 4 total. Some green decks are desperate enough for a removal spell that they'll play this, but it's a stretch to call this a protection spell. Next is Regenerate. Regenerate is very similar to Indestructible because it only protects against damage and effects that say destroy, but it removes the creature from combat, which makes it worse than a lot of the other keywords like Indestructible or protection from a color, especially in aggressive decks. There are also quite a few relevant removal spells that directly qualify that the creature can't be regenerated. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't play any of these effects though. Regenerate has been printed on a lot of cards, so there's a lot of variety in other things you can get other than just regenerating. Welding Jar only regenerates artifacts, but it's free, so there are a few decks where it comes in handy, but most decks don't care that much about their artifacts. Herbal Poultice costs 3 to activate and it regenerates a creature. The cost is pretty high even if it can't be countered. Death Ward does not provide any other kind of value, so it's pretty unplayable. Dawn Charm is an awesome modal spell. I really love holding up a Dawn Charm as a protection spell, and if you don't have to use it to regenerate a creature, the fog can often turn a game around. The last ability to counter a spell that targets you is also relevant for fireballs and targeted edicts. Fanatical Devotion allows you to regenerate a creature by sacrificing a creature. The best part of this is that it requires no additional mana to invest, so in a way, you always get to keep whatever creature of yours is better, and White excels at making large numbers of creatures. Boon of Erebos gives the creature +2 power in addition to regenerating it, at the cost of 2 life. You at least only lose the life if the spell resolves, because it's not an additional cost, but Boon of Erebos is worse in most situations than Unnatural Endurance, which has Devoid and doesn't make you lose 2 life. The 2 extra power that each of these gives makes them a pretty decent combat trick for an aggressive deck. Bolting Snakeskin can be cast at sorcery speed and costs 3 mana to regenerate the creature, so it's a pretty bad protection spell. Dark Privilege gives a creature +1/+1 and allows you to sacrifice a creature to regenerate the enchanted creature. This sees play in some decks because it allows you to sacrifice the creature. In my opinion, the +1/+1 and Regenerate are better than something like Bloodthrone Vampire because it makes a better creature harder to kill. Skeletal Grimace is very similar to Dark Privilege, except it costs a black to regenerate instead of sacrificing a creature. This card has some glaring weaknesses, but I've actually seen it put in a lot of work at casual tables. Blessing of Leeches is the real deal. It has flash and can repeatedly protect your creature for no additional investment. The drawback of losing 1 life a turn is easily overcome or played around, so the biggest drawback is that this initially costs 3 mana. I find that it's very easy to find a spot to play this defensively, and then you can immediately pivot into being aggressive with the creature, or you become very hard to attack. Butcher's Glee gives +3 power and lifelink in addition to regenerating your creature. The extra power combined with the lifelink have proven themselves worth 3 mana in aggressive decks. It allows you to beat through a large defender, while a considerable amount of life gain keeps you alive through an opponent attacking you back, all while ensuring that your creature lives through combat. But when it's not cast as a combat trick and purely as a protection spell, it's pretty bad, but at least it's an option. Dark Dabbling allows you to draw a card in addition to regenerating a creature, but the spell has Spell Mastery, so if you have 2 or more instant or sorcery spells in your graveyard, it regenerates all of your creatures, which makes it akin to Rootborn defenses, and your temple is under attack. Except this cantrips. This can be great if your deck is weak to board wipes, which is a little more rare in black. Necrobite gives your creature Death Touch in addition to regenerating it, which makes it even better than Butcher's Glee at taking down a large blocker, but without the defensive effect of allowing you to gain life, so this just doesn't hold up anymore. Wail of Nim allows you to regenerate each creature you control, or deal 1 damage to everything, and you can do both for an additional black, which makes it like Dark Dabbling and Rootborn defenses, but the 1 damage to everything is such a relevant mode that it allows this card to fit into a lot of decks. Goblin Chirurgeon allows you to sacrifice a goblin to regenerate a creature. It's important to note that this doesn't have to target a goblin, so even if your deck doesn't run goblins, this can sacrifice itself to act like a benevolent bodyguard in red, which is high praise, and it only gets better if you do happen to play additional goblin. Carapace gives the creature +2 defense and can be sacrificed to regenerate the enchanted creature, which makes this neither proactive or instant speed, so it's pretty bad. Bending Touch only regenerates a creature, so it doesn't do enough to be good. Seedling Charm, on the other hand, only regenerates green creatures, but it can also return an aura to its owner's hand, or give a creature trample. Each of the modes are low impact, but they're all relevant. I want to play this more, but the competition for green protection spells, or slots in general, are pretty hard to come by. Vitality Charm only regenerates beasts. It has other modes, but this just isn't a good protection spell. Village Elder is a creature that allows you to pay a green, tap it, and sacrifice a forest to regenerate a creature. Sacrificing a land is a pretty high price. Having to wait for this to not have summoning sickness is also pretty bad, which is probably why I've never seen it in play. Fortitude is an enchantment like Rancor where it returns to your hand if it goes to the graveyard from play. It requires you to sacrifice a forest to regenerate the creature, which, like Village Elder, is a steep cost when we could be playing a spell that just does that. Jolrael's Favor is another enchantment. It at least has flash, but it requires you to pay 2 mana to regenerate the creature, which is too much. The card named Regenerate has no other effects other than regenerating your creature, which makes this even worse than Mending Touch. The card Regeneration is a 2 mana enchantment that lets you pay a green to regenerate the enchanted creature. Like many of the other enchantments that came before it, being sorcery speed and requiring an additional mana investment isn't worth the potential repeatability. Rapid Vigor, finally, a decent card. This regenerates all of your creatures, so like Rootborn defenses and Dark Dabbling, this can protect all of your creatures against a sweeper, and at 2 mana, this is the most effective one. Broken Fall might be the best regenerate card. It's a 3 mana enchantment that can return to your hand to regenerate a creature, which means you don't have to pick which creature needs to be protected right off the bat. You can even play it before the creature you want to protect, because it doesn't cost mana to activate. The fact that it only needs to be returned to your hand means that it's repeatable and extremely resilient to removal. If this gets targeted, you can just return it to your hand to protect it. It's a little mana intensive, but it's frequently worth it. Refresh draws you a card in addition to regenerating a creature. With this, I'll just reiterate that I don't think you want to increase the mana cost of your protection spells to draw cards, because it's hard to play other cards the same turn you hold up this spell. Brushwood Herbalist is a creature that allows you to pay a green, tap it, and discard a card to regenerate a creature. I don't think I'd play this even if it didn't make you discard a card. Savage Silhouette and Trollhide are enchantments that give a creature +2/+2 and lets you pay 2 mana to regenerate the creature. I might run one of these if I really needed enchantments that pump power and toughness in a casual deck to get a little extra resiliency in combat, but I'd still be looking to cut them. Serpent Skin is an enchantment that has flash, gives the creature +1/+1, and allows you to regenerate the creature for a green. I would really want to play it in response to something or during combat, and 4 mana is a lot to hold up so that you can use it immediately. It is one of the better enchantments in green that do this though. Heal the Scars gains you life equal to the creature's toughness in addition to regenerating the creature. 3 additional mana over a Mending Touch is not worth it even if your creature is huge. Sporeback Troll is a creature with Graph 2 that allows you to pay 2 to regenerate a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. This is pretty good in a deck that cares about +1/+1 counters, but not great outside of it. Next is Shield Counters. Shield counters are similar to Regenerate and Indestructible in that they only work against damage or effects that say destroy, except being counters. They last past the end of the turn, so you have the option of just playing it with any spare mana before you untap, but you do run the risk of losing your value if the creature is removed in a way that the counter doesn't help with. Another difference is that when a counter is removed to prevent damage, it does so on the first instance of damage, regardless of if it would destroy a creature or not. Boon of Safety is an instant for a single mana that scries 1 in addition to putting a shield counter on something. As of the creation of this video, this is the only instant speed shield counter spell, and it's really not that great. None of the differences between shield counters and Indestructible or Regenerate are enough to push a flicker or spell that gives protection from a color out of a slot. Broker's Veteran is a 2/1 creature that puts a shield counter on another creature. The drawback of being sorcery speed is somewhat negated by the counter sticking around multiple turns, but I still think it will be very hit and miss if the counter will do anything. Next is Umbras. Umbras are auras that can be destroyed instead of a creature that would be destroyed, and all damage is removed from the creature. I'm not going to go through every Umbra because they're all pretty similar in terms of their ability to protect your creature, and this video is getting pretty long already. With the exception of Ill Umbra that has Flash, all of them are sorcery speed, which makes them a lot better when they synergize with your proactive plan. For example, if you need the pump and card draw from Snake Umbra, it can be nice to have the Umbra effect as a backup method of protection, but I wouldn't rely on it enough to tap out if I had the option to protect it with a spell as well. Next is Damage Prevention. Preventing damage is even more narrow than shield counters, Indestructible, and Regenerate, because it doesn't prevent effects that say destroy, but at least Pauper Commander doesn't have too many effects that say damage can't be prevented. There are so many unplayable damage prevention cards that I'd like to focus on a few of them that stand out. Pay No Heed looks like the most basic version of damage prevention, but it actually has some versatility, because it can temporarily stop damage from permanents like impact tremors, in addition to helping in combat, and protecting your creatures and life total from a damaging spell. It's also beneficial that it doesn't target, so the choice is made on resolution. I struggle to find which decks actually want this spell though. Worm's Cure can be played by tapping a creature if you control a plains, effectively making it a free spell, and free spells are always worth considering. 4 damage is pretty substantial too. Test of Faith has surprised me in its usefulness. 3 counters for 2 mana is pretty substantial, and the cost is that you have to put your creature into danger, which makes this great in an aggro deck, but like the rest of these, combat is most likely where you're going to be using this most of the time, and damage prevention from spells is going to take a back seat. Prismatic Strands and Safe Passage are both fogs that I rated very highly in my fog video because they're one-sided and can protect your creatures from non-combat damage. Watch my other video to learn more about these cards and others. Pop spells give your creature a toughness boost, which can help save your creature from damage-based removal and supplement an aggressive proactive plan, but damage-based removal spells only make up a small fraction of the removal in the format. So much so that I want to say that we've strayed into the territory of combat tricks, so again, I'll highlight my absolute favorites, all of which are free. I think the trade-off of blind spots that you accept by playing a pump spell versus how often you're able to hold up your spell set these over the edge. You always know that if the situation where one of these will be useful arises, the spell will be ready, which means you're able to tap out more often, increasing the speed and resiliency of your deck. Aerial Boost has Convoke, so you can play it by tapping 2 creatures. It gives a creature +2/+2 and flying, which can really surprise an opponent with a blocker, give you evasion, or protect your creature unexpectedly. Ramosian Rally can be played by tapping a white creature, and it gives all of your creatures +1/+1, which pushes your 2 toughness creatures out of the range of a fiery cannonade, or Evankar's Justice. Mutagenic Growth can be played by paying 2 life and gives your creature +2/+2. I love the consistency and tempo this gives any deck that wants to attack. Gather Courage has Convoke, so you can tap a green creature to play it. It also gives +2/+2, but you need an untapped creature, which is a bit inconsistent. Invigorate can be played for free by allowing an opponent of your choice to gain 3 life. It gives a massive +4/+4 until end of turn. A lot of people forget that this can be just played for 3 mana, but that's not even necessary if you're going for a commander damage kill. I end up putting this in quite a few decks, just for insurance against burn, but it finds other uses all the time. Hex Favor also has Convoke, but it's 3 mana, and green doesn't have as many tokens or creatures with vigilance as white, so it's not as free as these other spells. And our last category is counterspells. Counterspells are one of the best ways to protect your creature, but they're so versatile, I think they deserve their own video, so I'm not going to go into them here. To round out this video, I wish I could tell you how many of these effects to put in your deck, but that's so specific to each individual deck that I think that's impossible. There are many decks that don't run them at all, but if you do run any, hopefully you're able to optimize them better to have an additional mode, mess with your opponent's creatures, gain some additional value, or double as a combat trick. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything, or if you think my evaluation of a card is wrong. Thank you for watching until the end. Please consider giving this video a like, and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. Check the playlists on this channel for more videos like this. Patreon shoutout to Hive Cryptid and Bill, Too Much Do. Thank you.